The 2019 Summer Institute in Migration Research Methods provided 6 days of training in the use and analysis of migration data at Penn State University, targeting early career scholars. The Institute drew local and national experts to train attendees and provide on-site mentorship. Most participant costs were covered thanks to an award from the Russell Sage Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Julie Park, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland. She is joining us remotely today. Many researchers want to examine how immigrant groups change across generations following their arrival in a host society. But this can be challenging because there is not very good data that enables researchers to follow families over time and across generations. Dr. Park focuses on the different approaches that people have been taking to measure intergenerational change, despite these data limitations, and she offers us some methods that we could use to improve upon these approaches.
So, in thinking about the new second generation, I think one of my favorite kind of ways that the debate, I think, is epitomized or crystallized is kind of the back and forth in an issue of social forces, I believe, back in 2011. And basically, it started with an article by Haller et al. About downward assimilation for a significant proportion of the second generation, and looking at various outcomes and saying, you know, the picture looks rather bleak for a pretty sizable proportion of the new second gen. And so they get into that. And so as a response, in the same, you know, right after, in the next article, it might just be a commentary, but Alba et al. Argue that, well, the kids are mostly all right, saying, you know, vast majority, you see that there's upward mobility or intergenerational mobility. And then others, such as Tejas and Ortiz, really talk about, well, socioeconomic assimilation, it does occur, but it only occurs for children of the highest, of higher status parents. So how do we reconcile these disparate findings? And so I'm sure you've probably already figured out, well, it's the big one is, well, how do you look at time? And another one is, well, how do you, what outcomes are you looking at? And that really can determine whether you see things as glass half full or glass half empty. How do we measure intergenerational mobility, and how is that different from what we might assume as assimilation, or the idea of closing the gap with the mainstream or the US society more broadly? So if we think about intergenerational mobility, it's really comparing the first generation to the second generation. So visually, this is how it would basically be that, well, what is the difference, right?
There you go, yep.
Next, we also have to then take into consideration, but what was the mainstream standard and how has that changed simultaneously during the same time period in which we're observing the immigrant generations? And so that's also, we have to take into consideration that difference, the change that we observe for the mainstream. And ultimately, intergenerational mobility, as you see in the first, for the first arrow, that is really what we might consider mobility from generation to generation. But assimilation, we might, or at least socioeconomic assimilation, we might define as the gap becoming smaller between immigrants and the mainstream in 2005 than it was in 1980. And so this kind of narrowing or convergence from generation to generation, or from the first time period to the second time period. And many economists, you'll hear them call this a difference in difference model when they talk about it. Well, socioeconomic attainment increases over multiple dimensions in time. So if you can think about with successive immigrant generation, that we might see an increase for positive outcome variables. and perhaps a decline in much more in for other variables. But we also see that there could be changes over time by history as well as or by age. And so to be very careful in how you model this, not to conflate one dimension with the other, or make erroneous assumptions or conclusions about something that's happening when in fact it's maybe something else. So in tracking immigrant generations more specifically, ideally we would want to be able to, as Jenny mentioned, have kind of we could track generations, generation after generation of the same family. That would be ideal. And certainly there is an example of this that we see for the mainstream folks, the LSOG, or the longitudinal study of generations. And so you do see that there are some studies that you can get kinship structure from parents to children to grandchildren, so you can really see changes intergenerationally. But as it was mentioned, we really don't have that kind of data, with maybe a few exceptions, like the data that Tejas and Ortiz were able to tap into. So without that, having that kind of data, then many or some folks have taken to the idea, okay, well, perhaps we can practically use one cross-section of data, so one point in time, but kind of lag when you measure them. So an example of how this would look like, how a lagged birth cohort model would look like is, well, so maybe we can look at the first generation who are of grandparent age. So we'll look at, and Ren Farley and Richard Alba did this in a paper in IMR. Well, basically they looked at, okay, well, we'll look at immigrants who are the age, I think it was 50 to 65 or 45 to 65, and then we'll look at what will approximately be their children's age, maybe 25 to 44. And so this idea is that you lag and you measure and you kind of assume that if you're looking at the first generation at the older ages, and if you look at those who are maybe 20 years younger, then you're looking at approximately at the second generation, and we'll get into why that might not be the best approach. So the big question is, well, is there a compromise somewhere in between? Since we don't have the data we would ideally like, there are some problems with the lagged birth cohort approach. So is there some sort of compromise in being able to kind of track much more accurately generations across time? So what are some of the alternative ways or approaches to intergenerational mobility? The first one being the simple cross-section. So basically people get maybe data for one point in time, and they figure out, okay, well, how do we determine, or how do we define who's first generation, second generation, and third generation? And then they just show first, second, and third generation at one point in time. So basically, when you have a first, second, and third generation, that's fine, I think, to present it as data. But once you start making longitudinal interpretations with cross-sectional data, you're violating the very notion of, you can't assume that the children of, so the second generation that's measured in the same point in time, it cannot be the same age as their parents who are in the first generation, right? So you're violating this idea of time in terms of birth cohort, as the first person mentioned. And so basically you really can't make these kind of longitudinal interpretations with cross-sectional data. So the second one that I had mentioned earlier is the lagged birth cohort cross-section, and basically kind simulating in some ways the lag, and saying, so the oldest people in your sample are going to be the first generation, and then those who are younger than them would be the second generation, and then those maybe perhaps who are at the youngest ages could be the third generation. And so if you think about something like earnings, right? And we said, okay, we're all hoping that we make more money as we get older. And so then by the time you're at an older age, your income is going to be a lot higher, right? Hopefully, than those who are at the younger age. And so because there is an age effect, you might be underestimating intergenerational mobility because you're necessarily or unnecessarily comparing those who are in the first generation at older ages with those in the second generation who are at younger ages. And so no matter what, the second generation is going to be earning less. Does that make sense? And so you're making, again, you're violating certain dimensions of time by using, again, cross-sectional data to make longitudinal interpretation. Third, and this how more and more people started to take this approach, I think, in the early 2000s, where it was called the generation lagged across periods. And so basically, you look at the first generation in 1980, let's say, for example, and then you know that it's going to take about 25 years for there to be a second generation from the offspring or the children of the first generation to have reached to the same age range as the first generation in 1980. So it's going to take about 25, 30 years. So then you can then look at the second generation in perhaps 2005. And so a lot of people have taken this approach to say, this is how you would truly measure intergenerational mobility, by being able to look at two different generations at two different points in time, but at the same age. So you can really compare a lot more apples to apples. Now, the only problem with this is, for instance, if you think about education, the only problem is that there's also now period effects that they're not able to take into consideration when you look at just this. If you think about education, you know, the educational attainment expectations back in 1920, let's say, is certainly different than it was in 1950, 1970. Now the expectations around a college attainment, a college completion, is very different than it was even a few decades ago. And so certainly a big drawback of this approach, although much better than the first two, is that, again, they're not taking into consideration period effects or changes, as I mentioned, for the society more broadly. And so this is kind of where the immigrant generation cohort approach comes in, where it really takes into consideration not only the change from generation to generation, but it also takes into consideration societal changes that sets the context to kind of gauge whether it was true mobility or if it was an instance of a rising tide lifts all boats kind of effect. So the way we approached this was first to select out the first generation. So in order to do that, we wanted them to be the true parents of the second generation. So what we did is, using the 1980 decennial PUMS data, hierarchical files, we figured out, okay, and this is much easier now with the IPUMS, thanks to Stephen Ruggles and the Minnesota folks. But basically, you can figure out, okay, those who are foreign-born parents living with children who are born in the United States, we are going to select those immigrants. And because we want to compare apples to apples, we're going to just choose those parents who are who have children between the ages of 0 and 16, also their own ages are only between 25 and 44. We then want to observe, okay, so we now have figured out a way to define the first generation. Now you want to define the second generation. And I don't know, I haven't been able to look at the schedule, but I don't know how much you guys have delved into yet various large data sets. But basically, as of now, the current population survey is probably the biggest data set that has parental nativity. So you can figure out, you can really delineate, okay, even if someone is born in the United States, they're US born, you can figure out if they're second generation by looking at, well, were their parents born in the United States? And so what we did is we took the current population survey in 2005, and we actually pooled a number of years because we needed a larger sample. And basically, we defined and selected out the second generation in 2005, and to make sure that these are the second generation, 25 years later, that were in the same households as the parents we selected, we said we're going to select grown children now who are age 25 to 41, so they should be the exact second generation who lived with the first generation 25 years earlier. And then lastly, we selected, we defined the mainstream here as US-born white non-Hispanics to be kind of a proxy for the mainstream, both in 1980 and in 2005, and we were sure to make or select adults at comparable ages. So basically, this is what, as Jenny was mentioning, really kind of what's called a synthetic cohort method. So you're not necessarily tracing the same group of people, same group of individuals over time, but you are at least selecting individuals from the same cohort over time. So it's a little bit slippery, but basically it's the idea that you're at least sampling from the same cohort of people over time. And so with this kind of set up the data that way, and you can read about the way it's modeled, how we modeled the difference in difference in the paper. But really, the possible contrast or the comparisons that you can make using this approach is that you can certainly see, okay, so you can parse out what was the rate of societal change. So how did things change overall for from 1980 to 2005? Secondly, you can look at, well, what were the immigrants' parents' or status compared to the native born back in 1980? And how did the second generation children compare to the native born in 2005? And lastly, the second generation, how did they compare to their immigrant parents? So you can make these multiple comparisons depending on what your interest is or what you're wanting to look at more specifically. It makes a huge difference in the approach that you take in trying to determine how much intergenerational mobility there actually was from the first to second generation. And so we see that, for instance, for high school completion, the first kind of sets of numbers, you see that with a simple cross-section, you really underestimate the intergenerational mobility. The lack cohort, or lack birth cohort cross-section does estimate a larger amount of, or increase in mobility, but the immigrant generation cohort method really, you see that there's a much larger increase or a much more intergenerational mobility. For many indicators or outcomes, we see that the immigrant generation cohort approach actually shows much more intergenerational mobility than might be assumed with these kind of cross-sectional approaches, except with the exception of home ownership, but we can get into that a little bit later, because it does have much more of a period effect in there.
Thank you for watching. Please watch the other videos in the series using the links below.